So now with the Packers deciding to move on from Joe Barry, the question now becomes, who is going to be the next defensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers? And there's been tons of names floating out there as to potential candidates, guys who maybe would make sense in Green Bay. So I want to discuss a few in this video. But right now, there have not been any interviews that have been reported. And so we won't have an idea as to who the Packers are really focusing on until those interviews come out. Then we'll have a better idea of guys who have a chance of being the DC once the Packers start interviewing all these different kinds of candidates. And I think if you're the Packers and you've experienced 3 years under Joe Barry, where it wasn't, you didn't have a ton of success. It wasn't terrible. It could have been much worse than it was if you look at Barry's 3 seasons here in Green Bay. In all 3 seasons, he was 9th in total yards the first year, and then 17th in total yards the next 2 seasons. So could have been much worse. There's no doubt about that. But when you look at some of Matt LaFleur's quotes from late December, I think it gives you an idea as to the kind of DC Matt LaFleur wants to bring in, sort of the philosophy, at least a little bit. So here's from a Ryan Wood article from December 18th of Packers News. He said this: LaFleur said he absolutely will take a bigger role in ensuring defensive communication improves through the final 3 games. He expects to be more present with the defensive coaching staff, though it's unclear if that means attending any more defensive meetings than he has so far this season. On game day, LaFleur said he has overruled Barry's play calls before, requesting more aggressive calls, but it's difficult to do after a call is sent to the players before a snap. That would be a challenge, LaFleur said. I think that's something you almost have to talk to do prior to, but certainly, yeah, in the heat of the moment, that's happened before where, hey, we need to be more aggressive here, send 0 blitz, but usually you do that before the play call is made. So it sounded like Matt LaFleur wanted Joe Barry to be more aggressive at times, and from that article, he even overruled him at times, saying, send a 0 blitz, for example. So my guess would be if LaFleur has made the decision to move on from Barry, he clearly sees that a change needs to be made. And we've all witnessed this bend but don't break defense, lots of soft coverage, lots of third downs where guys are playing way off. LaFleur mentioned it here after the Bucs loss. I know there were some that Joe would like to have back, in particular some of those 3rd and 3 to 4 yard plays where we're playing soft zone and they can easily get a free completion, just like there were a couple calls I like to have back in the red zone, and that's football. So my guess would be that LaFleur would probably want to bring someone else in who operates in a different way than Joe Barry, someone who's more aggressive, maybe plays some, less soft zone, considering that's where it seemed like LaFleur had some issues at times with there not being enough, aggressiveness. Maybe he wanted some more blitzing at times, and Joe Barry was maybe more hesitant to dial those up. I do think later in the season we saw more of that start to happen with different blitzes, and that could have been because LaFleur was more involved on the defensive side of the ball. So my guess would be that the guy LaFleur brings in will probably have a more aggressive approach. That would be my guess, because I don't see, if you're LaFleur, why you would bring in someone who operates in the exact same way as Barry. That wouldn't make any sense. So that's sort of what I'm thinking right now. And one guy that I think just makes a lot of sense that lots of people have brought up is Wink Martindale, who is a veteran coach here in the NFL. And here's an interesting excerpt here from, I believe it's Bill Huber, who says this: with the Ravens, Martindale's units finished 1st in yards and 2nd in points in 2018, 4th in yards and 3rd in points in 2019, and 7th in yards and 2nd in points in 2020, before falling to 25th in yards and 19th in points in 2021. So he had a ton of success as the defensive coordinator with the Ravens for those few seasons until the final year. And then he's been with the Giants the past couple of years, but it seemed like there were some issues between him and Dabo, which sort of made him, he ended up leaving the Giants at the end of this year. But here's another quote that says from Bill Huber: this year the Giants finished 26th in points, but tied for 31st with takeaways. In their 24-22 victory in December, the Giants were the only team to hold Jordan Love in check during the second half of the season. So Wink Martindale is a very aggressive play caller. He was 2nd in the NFL this season with the Giants when it came to blitz rate. And even though that his defense did not play very well, I think that we see he's a history of when he has, some solid pieces there with the Ravens, their defenses performed very well. And so while with Joe Barry, before he came to Green Bay, he was the DC for 4 different seasons, 2 with the Lions, 2 with the Commanders. And in those 4 seasons, his defense ranked between 28th and 32nd in total yards all of those years. And so I think this time, if you're bringing in someone who already has defensive coordinator experience, I think that they need to at least have had some kind of success, because I think that there are lots of people that questioned and were wondering when Joe Barry came in, like why is he the guy when he hasn't really had success as a defensive coordinator, and now 3 years later he's out the door. So I think that if you do bring in a guy who has experience as a defensive play caller, he needs to at least have had some kind of top tier success as a defensive play caller, and Wink Martindale has. He's an aggressive play caller, as I said. And if we look at the Packers' takeaways this season, they're 25th in takeaways per game at 1.1. The Giants were first at 1.8. So I think that if the Packers' defense could be a more physical, more aggressive unit that forced more turnovers, I mean, that just bodes well for everybody. For Jordan Love, getting more possessions, getting an extra 0.7 possessions per game if you look at the Giants' turnovers forced or takeaways versus the Packers. So I do think Wink Martindale would make sense. But here's the thing. When we look at the hire of Joe Barry back in, 2021, Matt LaFleur had a prior experience with Joe Barry, and it makes sense. Like when you're the coach trying to decide who you want to bring in, a guy you're going to be with all the time, you probably lots of times would want to bring in someone that you have a familiarity with. That way you know how they operate, the way that they coach, so that way you can maybe have trust when they come in of what you're going to see. And so that's the one thing. Wink Martindale and Matt LaFleur don't really have any kind of history together. And so while I like the idea of Wink Martindale, at least right now in my mind, probably the top of the list if I just had to pick today. There are lots of other guys who have more of ties with LaFleur that could make more sense. And so I want to show you some of those guys. Here's from Jeremy Fowler, a guy who works for ESPN, who said this. On Packers DC search, a few names with ties to the team. Jerry Gray, Falcons assistant head coach with Green Bay from 20 to 22. He was worked with the DBs as well, that kind of thing. Still has many fans in the building. Could go to Jacksonville with Ryan Nielsen. Chris Harris, Titans pass game coordinator, interviewed well with Green Bay in 21. In mix for DC positions this cycle. And then the last one, also Rams pass game coordinator Aubrey Pleasant was on the Packers staff in 2022. Has been on DC interview circuit in recent years. So Jerry Gray, first off, we'll talk about, who was with Green Bay 2020 to 2022 as a DB coach, passing game coordinator. Bill Huber of Sports Illustrated said this. Gray was the strong suggestion by one player agent and one league source. And I remember when Gray was here in Green Bay, the defensive backs seemed to love him. And so considering LaFleur already has a history working with Jerry Gray, and the fact that the Packers also interviewed him back in 2021 when they decided to pick Barry, Gray could be in the running to become the defensive coordinator. Another one that was discussed, Aubrey Pleasant. He and LaFleur actually do have a history together. They were in Washington together in 2013. LaFleur was the QB coach, and Pleasant was the offensive assistant. And then with the Rams in 2017, Pleasant was the corner coach when LaFleur was the offensive coordinator. So for 2 separate seasons, they were coaching in the same place. And then finally, back in 2022, the Packers decided to bring in Pleasant to help with the offense, to sort of help them prepare for defenses and different kind of things like that. And here it is from Wikipedia. And they say this: after being fired by the Lions on November 14th, 2022, Pleasant was hired by the Green Bay Packers as an offensive consultant in order to give head coach Matt LaFleur defensive perspectives. So the fact that Matt LaFleur decided to bring him in at that time, of course he was fired, so it's not like LaFleur had a choice of any coach. The guy, was let go of by the Lions, and so he brought him in to help with the offense and give defensive perspectives. That is interesting. So I think we have to keep that guy in mind as well. And then a few other ones to finish off. One that's been talked about as well is Ron Rivera, and here's from Bill Huber, who says, Rivera was the first coach mentioned on Monday by another player agent who believed Rivera would be interested. And with Washington the last 4 years, as the coach there, their defense was 4th in points and 2nd in yards in 2020, really good. 25th in points, 22nd in yards in 2021, not as good. 7th in points, 3rd in yards in 2022, and then 32nd in points and 27th in yards in 2023. And those stats are from Bill Huber. And he also said, in 19 years as a coach or coordinator, his defenses finish in the top 10 in scoring 7 times and the top 10 in yards 10 times. So over Rivera's career, he's had a history of success. Nearly half the time he had a top 10 unit. And so I do like the idea of having someone come in who's already experienced success at the highest level as a defensive play caller. The other thing that could be possibilities bringing someone else in who does not have that defensive coordinator experience. And I think that if you bring a guy like that in, you clearly have to have a huge amount of confidence in their potential and what they can do. And so there's no doubt LaFleur and Green Bay, they're going to do their best to find who they think can get the most out of this Packers defense. So I really am curious to see the different people they interview. And if it's some random guy who they come in and becomes DC, I mean, it could work out. It's hard to really judge that when, we don't really have, I don't have an understanding of all these random position coaches on different defensive teams around the NFL. Whereas Matt LaFleur probably has a better understanding of, guys who could come in that maybe are relatively unknown and be solid coaches or a solid defensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers. But those are my thoughts for right now. If you want more Packers content, feel free to subscribe down below, and I'll see you guys next time.